Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our hotly anticipated webinar, The History of Grey's Anatomy. My name is Deborah Watkins and I'm from Elsevier, and I have the great pleasure and honour this evening to introduce our speaker today, Professor Susan Standring. When I read this following quote from Professor Standring, it will go, I think, some way to explaining her passion, her great passion and enthusiasm for anatomy. And she said, "I have spent much of my life wondering how living things are constructed. From an early age, I've wondered what's inside, what does it do, and how does that work?" Professor Standring went up to Guy's Hospital Medical School in 1964, initially to study medicine, but switched courses to study for a PhD in neuroscience. Over half a century later, she is Emeritus Professor of Anatomy at King's College London, a Fellow of King's College, an Honorary Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons, and describes herself as a grandma who knows a thing or two about skeletons. As a neuroscientist, Susan worked on the biology of repair in the peripheral nervous system for many years, and she's a past president of the Peripheral Nerve Society. As an anatomist, she taught medical and dental students and surgical trainees for over 40 years and has always championed applied anatomy and as a fundamental component of medical and dental syllabuses. She's also the past president of the Anatomical Society. In her retirement, she relishes having the time to research and write on applied anatomical topics and on the history of topographical anatomy and of peripheral nerve repair. Susan Standring is also very well known as the current editor-in-chief of Grey's Anatomy, from the 39th right through to the current edition, and joint lead editor of Grey's Surgical Anatomy. So I can't think of anyone really more qualified to tell us about the history of Grey's Anatomy, or anyone more passionate, actually. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Standring, and thank you, Susan, in advance for doing this for us this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Debs, and hello, everybody. We've just come through a big hailstorm here, but I hope it's not going to interfere with the lecture this evening. Now, Grey's Anatomy was first published in 1858, and it's been in continuous publication ever since. And from the beginning, it was enormously successful. And in order to understand quite why it was so successful, we have to go back over 100 years earlier, just to put things in context. So I'm going to start with this advertisement from the London Evening Post in 1746. It was placed by Dr. William Hunter and advertising his course in surgery and bandaging. It says, "Gentlemen may have the opportunity of learning of dissection during the whole winter season in the same manner as at Paris." And that manner was shown here. It was that students had the opportunity to dissect for themselves. They didn't just have to watch the professor dissect. Here is Hunter and he's dissecting or he's instructing, but his students have their own cadavers. Now, until this time, cadavers were obtained legally from the gallows. Criminals who were hanged could be anatomized, but a great many more cadavers were needed, particularly once students could start to do their own dissection. As we can see here on this little advertisement, it says prices for bodies. Bodies were obtained illegally thanks to the actions of the resurrectionists who dug up freshly buried bodies and took them at dead of night to the back doors of the surgeons and the anatomists. And here we can see Dr. Hunter, who's skedaddling away from an encounter. The watch, the beadles are swinging their rattles because they have discovered a body that has been freshly disinterred. The crime here, by the way, is not stealing the body, which was worthless. It was stealing the grave goods, stealing the shroud. And we see here a little bit later, Dr. Knox advertising in Edinburgh his course of lectures for potential surgeons and anatomists. Arrangements have been made to secure, as usual, an ample supply of anatomical subjects, as usual and totally illegally. This caused great consternation. Here we have surgeons and anatomists trying to learn more anatomy to better treat their patients, and yet they are being criminalized for accepting bodies illegally disinterred by the resurrectionists, who, by the way, were making a great deal of money. The body had become commodified. Well, as you can imagine, there was considerable disquiet. Something must be done. And whenever that is said, it normally leads to a parliamentary select committee. And that's what happened here. A select committee was appointed to inquire into the manner of obtaining subjects for dissection in the schools of anatomy and into the state of the law affecting the persons employed in obtaining and dissecting bodies. Something had to be done about this because so many people were being disinterred and all sorts of measures were taken by grieving relatives to try and prevent the resurrectionists from taking the bodies. Well, at the select committee, and if you have the opportunity to read the report, it is absolutely fascinating. But I've just selected a couple of question and answers that the members of the committee had with Sir Astley Cooper. Now, he was then the president of the Royal College of Surgeons, and he was probably the most eminent surgeon of the age. And he gave very robust replies to the questions. But here's the first question. What is your opinion as to the necessity of dissection? And he says, without dissection, there can be no anatomy. Without anatomy, a surgeon can do nothing, certainly nothing well. And the second question is pertinent today as it was then. Can a student know when to cut with freedom, when with caution, and when not at all, if he has not an intimate knowledge of the structure of every part of the human body? In other words, do you know when it's safe to explore, and when are you verging into tiger territory? When is the danger of causing a iatrogenic injury quite high? And Astley Cooper, again, it's a robust reply. It's quite a long one, but this is the main point. He says, he must mangle the living if he has not operated on the dead. I think that's quite clear, his opinion there, that dissection was important. You needed it in order to practice surgery. Now, something else came out of the report of that select committee, some of the evidence. It wasn't just that we needed more cadavers, but also that all was not well with the state of anatomy teaching and research in Great Britain. Here, for example, is a comment made by Sir William Lawrence to that select committee. The foreigners who visit this country, and he was talking specifically of his French and German and Italian colleagues, are generally better informed in anatomy than we are. We have no original standard works at all worthy of the present state of knowledge. And that is reflected in the report of the select committee. English students, desirous of obtaining a thorough knowledge of the science, desert the schools at home and repair to those abroad, which is exactly what William Hunter had done. He'd gone to Paris in order to study midwifery and to study anatomy. Well, what were the books that were available to the students in France and Germany? Many of them were beautifully illustrated. Some of them were atlases. And there you can see a page from an atlas by Jean Cloquet. Beautiful colored studies, not many labels, little letters, but that's about all. You probably had to break the code of those labels in another volume of the atlas. But here is somebody reviewing Knox's translation into English from the French of this atlas, and says, we have an absolute want of a treatise in the English language. There is a deficiency in the anatomical literature of this country. That's pretty hard-hitting, but it sums up the situation. Were the books that were available at the time? Well, I could show you a number of them. Here are just three. If I asked you to guess how many pictures there are in these books, most of them, there are no pictures at all. And those that are often at the end, and they're often very old drawings. They're copies of Vesalius or Cheselden. They're not originals. Why was that? Well, here is a comment from Abraham Collis of Collis Fracture fame. And he's commenting on the fact that there are no pictures in his books. And he says, you may possibly think it a defect that this work is not accompanied by plates. Had they been added, the price must necessarily have been too extravagant for an elementary treatise. So you had to go to your dissecting class, dissect or watch a dissection, remember what you had seen, maybe make some notes, no photographs, no books with diagrams. Well, the outcome of the Select Committee was the passing of the first Anatomy Act in 1832. And as you can see, William IV, an act for regulating schools of anatomy. And I've chosen just one bit, part 10. and I've cut it down, but it contains the essence of what is important here. The Act said, "It shall be lawful for any fellow or member of any college of physicians or surgeons, or to any professor, teacher, or student of anatomy, medicine, or surgery, to receive or possess for anatomical examination the body of any person deceased." So no longer did the anatomists and the surgeons have to rely upon the few bodies that were cut from the gallows. No longer did they have to rely upon the illegal activities of the resurrectionists. They could now legally obtain cadavers. It has to be said, and the Anatomy Act is often seen as a forerunner of the Poor Law, that almost all of those bodies came from the poorhouses, the almshouses. And so there were all sorts of societal issues associated with this. But as far as the anatomists and surgeons were concerned, they now had an ample supply of cadavers. Well, now we move on to 1858, and 1858 is the year in which Gray's Anatomy was published. Three important things here. The Medical Act, the first Medical Act, we've now moved on to the reign of Victoria. It's an act to regulate the qualifications of practitioners in medicine and surgery, in order that persons requiring medical aid should be enabled to distinguish qualified from unqualified practitioners. That immediately brings up the sense that there are examinations that must be passed, there are qualifications. We're starting to standardize and regularize what is required in order to be a doctor or a surgeon. And in order to register all of these doctors, these qualified practitioners, the General Medical Council was established. Now you will see that this is the first page, and it's 1859, because so many people applied to be registered that there was a 6-month delay in publication. So this is the, if you like, the equivalent of the computer crashing when the government announces some new initiative. And the General Medical Council, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is still very important today, and one of its remits is to look into the state of medical education. It continues to do that. But also in 1858, the first edition of Gray's Anatomy appeared. It obviously appeared at a very prestigious time. We needed textbooks for students of surgery and anatomy. There was more dissection that was being undertaken, and there was an increase in the amount of regulation and legislation of medical practice. So you couldn't have dreamt of a more propitious time for this book to be launched. And here we can see it. It's very simple. It's brown buckram on the spine in gold, Anatomy, Descriptive and Surgical, Gray's Anatomy, Descriptive and Surgical. That was the name of the course of lectures that Henry Gray gave to students at St. George's Hospital, and the drawings were by Henry Carter, and it was published by John Parker in the Strand. Now, let's just think about these two men for a moment. Henry Gray was described as a very rising man. He was highly ambitious, very hardworking, very well born. He was already a fellow of the Royal Society when he was only 23, which would be almost unthinkable today. He had already won 2 prestigious awards, the triennial essay of the Royal College of Surgeons on the innovation of the eye, and the Astley Cooper Prize on the spleen. And in both of those initiatives, he had been aided by this man, Henry Vandyke Carter, who was also a doctor at St. George's, who was a talented artist, but very quiet. He was not so well born as Henry Gray. He was very devout and rather quiet. And he had also been off to Paris to study, and he'd also worked with Richard Owen. And he had illustrated those 2 essays for Henry Gray. And Henry Gray, I think, had not acknowledged him. But as we will see, that is not something that Henry Gray tended to do with his collaborators. And I don't think he paid him very much. So in his diary in November 1856, Carter says, Gray had made a proposal to assist him by drawing in bringing out a manual for students. It was a good idea, but it didn't come to any plan. Well, it clearly did come to a plan, because between November 1856 and 1858, the 2 men got together and Gray's Anatomy was produced. How well did Gray and Carter get on? That's something that has interested people. When we look at the preface to the first edition, Henry Gray says he gratefully acknowledges the assistance of his friend, Dr. Henry Vandyke Carter. All the drawings from which the engravings were made were executed by him. And in the majority of cases, they have been copied from or corrected by recent dissections made jointly by the author and Dr. Carter. So he refers to Carter as his friend. But if you look at the draft of the frontispiece of the first edition, there's a slightly different take on that. Up here we can see, send a revise before finally printing it off. That's written by Henry Gray. And what Gray has done is he's scribed out Henry Carter's name there, and he said, type the size of the type below. He wants it much smaller. And he also wants to take out from there the fact that Carter is going off to India, to a medical college, Grant Medical College in what was then Bombay, now Mumbai. He says, omit that, so that it looks as though it's only late demonstrator in anatomy at St. George's. The man could be dead. Well, John Parker, who had worked with both of these men and was the printer, the publisher, he says, no, I'm going to put Carter's name back. He still leaves it only as late demonstrator, but at least he's establishing Carter. In my opinion, Carter's name should have been as big as Gray's, but there we go. The mission statement, if we can call it that, at the beginning of the preface, Gray wrote, this work is intended to furnish the student and practitioner with an accurate view of the anatomy of the human body, and more especially the application of this science to practical surgery. Very, very clear what this is about, accuracy and application. And when we look at that accurate view, they are beautiful pictures undertaken by Carter. We can see transverse sections. We can see diagrams that show students where to cut on a cadaver if they're dissecting. And there are a very few illustrations here. There's a section on fractures of the long bones and the disposition of the limbs when a fracture has occurred, and some writing about how you might bandage and splint these fractures. But they are beautiful and they are large and they are labelled. And as you can see, they have labels and leader lines. And on occasion, there's also writing actually on the material. They're not coloured. You may see first editions of Gray's that are coloured, but they've been hand coloured. These were not coloured. Now, that has never really changed. The diagrams that have come down to us and that you will have used as students, and some of you are still using as students, they haven't changed. It's what Martin Kemp, who is an art historian of great renown, he calls it styleless style, almost dismissively. I don't think that's quite the case. It is a very particular style. It's not like the muscle men of Vesalius wandering through the Tuscan countryside. Neither does it show you the rather cruel pictures of people like Estienne when we're looking at the dissected parts with chains holding parts and nails and knives on display. This is just a diagram of the anatomy. All of the packing material has been taken out. The fascia is missing. Most of the small vessels and nerves are missing. And whether we're looking at the first edition of Gray's or whether we're looking at much more modern text using now computer-assisted drawing very often, we're still looking at the same very familiar diagrams that give us some sense of the relationship of anatomical structures. Of course, students, once they get into theatres, are absolutely amazed and say, well, it doesn't look a bit like the diagram in my book. Well, because it's had an awful lot of material taken out. But those are the diagrams that have come down the ages to us. Now, Ruth Richardson has called the labelling that Henry Carter applied. She's talking about the earlier labelling as proxy labeling. This from Wilson, from Quain, said diagrams have these little letters and numbers, and you have to look on the same page or another page to break that code, just as you had to sometimes in another edition of Cloquet's Atlas. When we look at Gray, first of all, the pictures are much bigger, because they may take up a whole page, for example, and they are labelled, and there are leader lines, which we use today. And again, here we can see the difference here and the clarity and the ease of use between this from Quain of the abdomen and this from Gray's first edition. But it's not true to say that Carter invented it. It's often said that he did, but he didn't. This is the base of the skull from the first edition of Gray. And this, just published a few years earlier, is Luther Holden's book on osteology. And you can see that Holden had already developed this style of using labels and leader lines and also showing muscle attachments on the bone. So Carter had very properly copied it because he felt this was a very user-friendly way of learning anatomy. We use it today. When you read the text of the first edition, it's quite clear that you're reading the words of a man who has done this for himself. He's seen this in theatres and in his patients and in his dissections. He talks a lot about peculiarities, which we would call today variants, talking about the internal carotid. It may arise from the arch of the aorta. It may be lost altogether. And the book is full of what Gray calls surgical anatomy, which may be a description of an operation. It may be telling you how to avoid particular structures. This, I think, is lovely. The cervical part of the internal carotid is sometimes wounded by a stab or gunshot wound in the neck, or even occasionally by a stab from within the mouth, as when a person receives a thrust from the end of a parasol or falls down with a tobacco pipe in his mouth. One can only assume these must have been characters and conditions that Gray had actually seen. Not the kind of thing you'd see in A&E today. Right at the back of the book, Gray has 2 chapters which he calls surgical anatomy. And I thought when I first saw the first edition of Gray's, oh, this is going to be regional anatomy or how to do operations in more detail. In fact, what it is the regional anatomy of cadaveric dissection. And he deals with inguinal and femoral hernia, the perineum and the ischiorectal region, with very specific attention to the course taken by urine in rupture of the urethra, the parts concerned with the operation of lithotomy, and again, going back to that question to Astley Cooper, the parts to be avoided, the tiger territory, and the abnormal courses of arteries in the perineum. And Gray also helps his students. He said, when, for example, you're dissecting the extraocular muscles, on one side of the subject, do the dissection, and on the other side, undertake the operation for strabismus, correction strabismus. He also, and this may horrify everybody, he also mentions the useful fingernail. When you're operating, the external iliac vein can be cautiously separated from the external iliac artery by the fingernail. You can tear through the deep fascia with the fingernail and you can see the IJV. And you can search for the subclavian artery, having divided the deep fascia with the fingernail. I do hope he scrubbed his nails afterwards, but there you go. So you can see this is a book that is very much written by a practitioner. It's beautifully illustrated, full of illustrations, far more than any other book at the time. And not surprisingly, the reviews were fantastic. I mean, this is the kind of thing you'd really like to see on Amazon or something, 5 stars. The Lancet says, there is not a treatise in any language in which the relations of anatomy and surgery are so clearly and fully shown. The British Medical Journal says it's far superior to all other treatises on anatomy, a book which must take its place as the manual of anatomy, descriptive and surgical. Now, to have those kind of reviews in the Lancet and the BMJ, you could not ask for more. And when the book, the first edition, was published in America, Carter was praised, and in particular, the illustrations are to his credit, their originality and brilliancy, the novelty of their size and number. That's really what sold this book. It was the pictures. They can hardly fail to captivate the student, and they deserve the highest of praise for their general accuracy and correct drawing. That word accuracy keeps coming back. It's so important. But 1859, in the Medical Times and Gazette, there was a truly horrific review of the book, but really it was an attack directly on Gray. It's a very long review. It goes on for several pages, but this is just give you an idea. A more unphilosophical amalgam of anatomic details and crude surgery we never met with. We are not identified, reviewers are not identified, so we don't know who wrote it. Is it honest to compile without citation of originals in such a manner as to lend the inference that the facts and conclusions so positively stated are Mr. Gray's own? And then it goes on, unalloyed descriptions of parts that must be crammed for examination or that may be cut in operations as would be welcomed by a college of barber surgeons. Well, actually, that part's fine because that is saying this book does what it says on the tin. It prepares you to take the exams that you require in order to be registered as a surgeon. Gray is clearly here being attacked for dishonesty, for not referencing other people. There's very little evidence of anybody coming to his defense or of anybody actually saying very much, but very quickly a letter appears in the Lancet from Dr. George Halford, and he says, "I wish to call attention of your readers to this review. I feel sure that after comparing the book with the review, they will be ashamed that such a review should appear in any medical paper. I will leave Mr. Gray to answer the charges brought against him of dishonesty." But Halford then says that the book is especially adapted to the medical student, that the style is what's needed at the present day. And then he goes on, by all means, let the student possess his Quain and work with his Ellis, Holden or Dublin dissector. Dublin dissector doesn't have any pictures, neither does Ellis. The majority of men will do neither. Henceforth, I predict they will get on faster and better with Gray. So it's perfectly reasonable to say, was that criticism deserved? Gray had a reputation, as I mentioned, when he was working with Carter, of not citing his collaborators. In fact, there were several quite serious arguments that arose because of that, not with Carter, but with other collaborators. But in the preface for the first edition, when we get beyond that mission statement, actually, Gray does something which would appear to be quite unusual for him. First of all, he acknowledges Holden. Then he talks about the veins of the spine, illustrated from the well-known work of Brechet, and then he talks about the lymphatics copied from the elaborate work of Mascagni. So he is, in fact, acknowledging the work of others. And in fact, if you read through some of the text, he does talk about others occasionally, but not here in the preface. And frankly, if I were to ask an audience of anatomists and surgeons to describe the femur or describe the carpal bones or describe the spleen or the thyroid gland in 300 words or less, my guess is that most of you would use the same sets of words, maybe in different order, but it would all look pretty similar. As was said in a review of Quain a little earlier in 1849, treatise on anatomy obviously affords little scope either for analysis or critical discussion. There are a few questionable points in the whole subject. Little of novelty can reasonably be looked for in the entire mass of matter of which such a work is composed. In other words, anybody describing something in anatomy is going to say much the same thing. I love this comment from Clinton Dent in Pla's Life of the Fellow. He was a surgeon. Forgetfulness of the source from which we are borrowing is an extremely common form of originality. Most students use that at least once when they're presenting an essay uncited to their tutors. So we have no idea how Gray responded to this, except in his preface to the second edition, and he only edited 2 editions. The next year, he died. He contracted confluent smallpox from his nephew and he died. So this is his second edition preface, no contrition, and this is all it is. I regard this as a kind of talk to the hand preface. In preparing a second edition of my descriptive and surgical anatomy, no mention of Carter, I trust I have corrected any inaccuracies. Pages have been revised. Additional matter has been added, several new illustrations, executed with great care and fidelity by Dr. Westmacott, which tells us, of course, that only the first edition exclusively contains illustrations by Carter. And in fact, Gray, against type, when we get to the end of the osteology section, in very small font, he adds this. He says, for further information on osteology, the student is referred to Cruvalier, to Humphrey, to Arnold, and to Todd and Bowman, to Colliker. He's actually citing other people, so he has learned a bit. Well, Gray dies, as I said, and there are very few obituaries. And what was to happen to his book, which had started so well and had, despite that rather unpleasant review, had done very well, sold very well? What happened next? Well, it continued. And it was edited next by Timothy Holmes. Timothy Holmes was a surgeon at George's. He had been responsible probably for copy editing and proof editing, the first 2 editions. And I'm going to read just a little bit of his preface to you because only in the preface do you really get to understand what the editors are thinking. And this preface summarizes an argument that dragged on until the 20th century about what should be in and what was useful and what was really necessary. And Holmes said the absence of any attempt in this work to teach the rudiments of scientific as distinguished from descriptive anatomy was discussed with Gray. But it was thought that so long as the examining bodies do not exact a knowledge of this branch of science as a necessary part of medical education, well, it would be unwise to encumber the pages of a work designed specifically for students with matter which, however interesting and valuable in itself, could hardly be regarded as essential. In other words, we're going back almost to the comments made by that unpleasant review. The book does what it says on the tin. This is a book to prepare students to pass their exams and to apply that knowledge to the treatment of their patients, normally as surgeons. Moving on again, Gray's attempted to keep pace. The editor now was another surgeon, and this was now Thomas Pickering Pick. And Pickering Pick is very keen to say that several sections, particularly in microscopic anatomy, have been altered or entirely rewritten to keep pace with the ever-increasing activity of research in this branch of the science of anatomy. We can see here, for example, this is the innervation of muscle, some cardiac muscle, a little bit of here, 4 diagrams to show the division of the yolk, and here we can see a diagram of a villus. So he's keeping pace with what is coming from the scientific anatomists. That's what's adding most to the book. And he maintains this 10 years later. But again, he's having this terrible argument about who should be using this. The work is intended for students of surgery rather than for the scientific anatomist. And yet, as you can see from the pictures here, which are of histology, cell division, bone, and a lot of developmental material, it's all material that's been produced by the scientific anatomists. And he goes on, not that the editor would wish to disparage the study of scientific anatomy, but he thought it right, considering the class of students for whom the work is primarily intended, that it should be practical rather than abstract and theoretical. Not realizing, obviously, at that time, just how practical knowledge of development and of histology would be in informing pediatrics and in informing histopathology. But that was the argument at the time, and so we've come almost to the end of the 19th century. The book has been edited by surgeons, and it is very specific in its intent. It is designed for students of surgery. So it's, at this point, just have a look at the anatomy of Gray's anatomy. It starts off in 1858 as descriptive and surgical. Then general anatomy is rewritten as an introductory chapter by Holmes, and he says he's not going to bother to put in new drawings. He says, in order to make such a verbal description intelligible, figures are necessary. What a change from Abraham Collins saying you don't need pictures. You don't need pictures to understand this, and they're too expensive. It appeared useless to manufacture new drawings of things which are quite faithfully represented by authors who are in everybody's hands, and so all the illustrations in that chapter are borrowed from well-known works. He's learnt to cite other people well. And you can see that as we go on down, there's a modification of anatomy, rewrites of visceral anatomy and the anatomy of the kidney, and then Pickering Pick in 1887 brings in colour. Wasn't terribly successful initially, half-tone dots, but it did establish the yellow for nerve, red for arteries, blue for vein convention that we have today. And at last, Gray's decided that, yes, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Up until that time, Gray's had stuck faithfully to Thomas Willis's description of 9 pairs of cranial nerves, despite the fact that the rest of Europe had been following Summering's view of 12 pairs of cranial nerves for over 100 years. And you can see, as we come into the 20th century, it becomes descriptive and applied. And the terminology of the Basel nomina anatomica was used, and Carter's name is deleted. It disappears entirely. And then in 1938, not much happens in the intervening period. In 1938, it becomes Gray's anatomy, and X-ray plates are introduced. Professor Tilly Tansey, when she was writing about Gray's Anatomy, she described 4 stages. She describes the inception and the consolidation, which I've mostly been talking about now. And then she says the book goes into a period of stasis for a very long time. And this is the period of stasis round about here and going on right through the first half of the 20th century, when not much really happens to the book, except that an awful lot of the surgical anatomy comes out. And the book is edited by anatomists who are clinically qualified, but very little surgical contribution. And I wanted to stop at this point because I want to just introduce what I think is an interesting point or a conundrum. Gray's Anatomy introduces X-ray plates in 1938. And yet, if I just take a little diversion here, as we can see, Röntgen introduced X-rays in 1895. First X-ray he took was of his handgun. The second X-ray he took was of Mrs. Ronson, Bertha Ronson's hand. And we can see that very quickly this comes into clinical practice. Here we can see a practitioner testing using a handheld fluoroscope, and you can see taking an X-ray of his colleague's hand. You will notice all the health and safety that's being attended to here. And here we can see Eddie McCarthy, 1896. This information has gone very quickly around the world. He fell while skating on the Connecticut River and he fractured his wrist. And there we can see there is the resulting picture. And anatomists were using it here. 1897, the anatomists have used lead paint injected into the vessels of a cadaveric hand and x-rayed it. And here we have an American soldier who was fighting in the Philippines and sustained, as you can see, a bullet in his occipital lobe. So x-rays were being used, but they don't appear in Gray's for a very long time. And I wonder why that is. Is it because the anatomist felt that x-rays didn't add anything further that could not be seen by dissection? Is it that there was such a division between the basic science of anatomy and the application clinically that it wasn't regarded as something that anatomists should do? I don't know. We've certainly made up for it in the 42nd edition, but I'm just interested, and if anybody has any ideas, I'd love to know why there was this lag. But if we go back to the anatomy of Gray's, coming out of that very long period of stasis, what Tilly Tansey calls the Renaissance of Gray's, was the work by Peter Williams and Roger Warwick from the 35th through to the 38th edition. They started off saying the majority of the revision, they undertook most of it, but for the 38th edition, they had an editorial board and a massively increased visual impact of the book. It suddenly got much bigger. And this is the very arresting cover, hardcover of the 38th edition. But the book remains all this way from the beginning systematic. Roger and Peter had a vision of anatomy. They said it's no longer just descriptive and applied. They recognized the enormous explosion in knowledge that had occurred, and they wanted their anatomy to be evidence-based. They wrote to many colleagues around the world in order to help them revise the work. And they introduced other material about evolution and about techniques, which amplified the book. The increased visual impact is very obvious when we look at this. This is Henry Carter's drawing of the spleen, which is in the first edition, but it's also the drawing that he made for one of Gray's essays. And this is Richard Moore's take on the 2 circulations in the spleen for the 38th edition. There's a huge difference. You can see there's a vibrancy throughout the book. And the book is energized in a way that it hadn't been for a very long time. And then I was invited to take on the editorship for the 39th through to the 42nd edition. And I changed the book to being a regional book on the basis that that is how anatomy presents to a clinician, and called the book The Anatomical Basis, not of surgical practice, but of clinical practice, because every clinician uses anatomy in some form or other. And the 42nd edition, and these are some of the images from the 42nd edition, contains a substantial online-only content. It has an imaging library and videos, commentaries, which were essays that I invited from colleagues all around the world on anatomy and subjects which are not yet mainstream, but which were exciting. And one of the things I found, such as the draw of Gray's Anatomy, that I could write to people I'd never met and just say, you know, I'd love you to write. I've just seen your paper in Nature or Science, or whatever. Would you write something for me? And normally, in fact, in only one case, and I think he was away, people replied by return and said, yes, please. And I've also brought back 2 systems-based chapters on all the blood vessels, lymphatics, and on the peripheral nerves, which is in the online version. So you can see the book has grown. It's many pages, additional pages online, many, many images. And one of the most exciting things about the way I've been working with colleagues is the impact that the modern imaging has on our understanding and knowledge of anatomy. Now, the book was published in the UK and in America. In the UK, it was published by Parker and then by Longmans for a very long time, Churchill Livingstone, and now by Elsevier. And in the States, it was sold to sorry, I'm having a problem with my mouse here, sold to Blanchard and Lee and to Lee Brothers. And for 25 editions, it appears in America. It has different editors and it appears rather like this. And so you'll see the frontispiece will say things like a revised American edition from the 15th or whatever English version. So it's the book is rather different, the American version. The American editors tended to be surgeons, but there was a fair amount of interaction between the American and the English editors. Here, for example, the Americans are thanking Mr. Ross, demonstrator of anatomy at St. George's, for the time and trouble he's devoted to investigating several subjects on which there appeared to be a difference of opinion amongst anatomists. I cannot imagine the differences of opinion amongst anatomists. It seems very strange. And here we have the English edition saying that the description of the peritoneal folds is so complicated, they thought it would be better if they could use an account published in the American edition. So that's rather nice. And then there's something else here. I think the American editors took the task rather more seriously than some of the English editors. This is William Keane, who was a surgeon in one of the American editions, and he is saying, in the section on the brain, I rejected the English woodcuts showing the Sulcine convolutions, and I've added a section on cerebral localization and topography, subject of great and increasing importance, especially in view of the recent rapid strides in cerebral surgery. Well, hooray! But you don't see that, you don't get that impression from the English version. The chief anatomical textbook in the English language ought not, I think, to be behind in this department, but should give the fullest and most accurate knowledge obtainable. Absolutely, amen to that. Now, I'm often asked, surely there's nothing new to discover in anatomy. Yes, there are variations. We all remember when we were students back in the dissecting, rushing up to the tutor and saying, I've just found something on the tendon of flexor digitorum superficialis, for example. Well, yes, lots of people do that, but that's just a variant. But there are more important things than that. New things that have been discovered largely as a consequence of new techniques. For example, last year, a retrospective radiological study of PSMA CT PET, prostate-specific membrane antigen PET on men, showed that not only the prostate lit up, but so too did the major salivary glands. And not only the major salivary glands, but also these structures here, which when dissections of male and female frozen, thawed, unembalmed cadavers were made, were found to be extensive collections of salivary tissue around the nasopharyngeal opening of the pharyngotympanic tube. I have said there's nobody noticed the lacrimal glands, but nobody seems to take any notice of that. But interesting, this is something that was not seen before. These are not the minor salivary glands dotted around the soft palate. These have been called the tuberial salivary glands. Then, of course, I'm sure many of you will already be very familiar with the extraordinary impact of the work of Calvin Coffey and his friends, reimagining the mesentery and the enormous impact this is having on mesenteric surgery. Then we have a different scale altogether, but studies of rhombomeres in the developing brainstem using all manner of genetic techniques, developmental gene expression, for example, and showing that in fact the isthmus is in the hindbrain. The isthmus, which is a very important organizer of the brainstem, is the isthmus, and the fourth nerve nucleus, the trochlear nucleus, should be, for example, in a hindbrain and not where they had been placed before. So these are important. We would not have known about them unless people start looking, using new techniques and taking a different gaze, the anatomical gaze, which is so often talked about, looking at the body again, and I'm sure there'll be other things which will be discovered. The bane of my life, and the bane of every anatomist's life, I think, is terminology. It has been said that anatomists would rather share their toothbrushes than their terminology. And back in 1895, the Basel Nomina Anatomica Terminology, there was a big conference. I think the Brits did not go, but what's new about that? But finally, the terminology, which sought to develop a consistent, recognized terminology for all the structures in the body, was finally introduced into Gray's in the 17th edition in brackets after the names commonly used by the English anatomists. And then here we have T.B. Johnson a long time later in the 25th edition saying in his preface, "It is my earnest hope that before another edition of this work is published, the question of terminology will have been settled and an unproductive subject will have ceased to occupy attention. Do not believe that for a moment. It still does." We have Terminologia Anatomica, Embryologica, Histologica, and Neuroanatomica. And these are the agreed forms, the terms that we should use for everything, both in Latin and in American and English, and the synonyms. And you can look all this up online in the FEPAT library. And as far as possible, the anatomy, the terms in Gray's anatomy are Terminologia Anatomica compliant. Very often where there are more than one term is used, you will meet all of those terms at first usage with the preferred term first and all the others in brackets. But every so often, my clinical colleagues will say, actually, nobody uses that term. And we use, surgeons very often have consensus groups, and they will say, well, we all use these terms. So it's slightly difficult. There still isn't consistency. We're still working towards it. I think very often the surgeons using new techniques and seeing very detailed anatomy, they have gone to a different level very often with their consensus documents. Should we abandon eponyms? Well, there's a large section on eponyms in the online-only portion of Gray's. There is an argument for retaining them. There's an argument for not using them. All I can say is that it's a work in progress. I think we would be lost without eponyms because they're not used just for structures, they're used for protocols, for instruments, for approaches. I think it'll be a long time before they disappear entirely. Gray's has evolved into a very large family, as you can see. The Surgical Anatomy, which was a book which came out last year, or maybe the year before. This is a book which will go into the operating theatre. I hope that Henry Gray would have approved of it because it gives you the anatomy that is involved in all of the sort of core operations. Of course, there is also a television series, but that's spelt differently. But there can't be many anatomy textbooks that lend their name to a television series. And so here we are. This is Henry Gray and Henry Vandyke Carter. Henry Gray died, as I said, prematurely. There are very few obituaries of him, and he is buried, here he is, and he's buried in Highgate Cemetery, and that is his mother who died afterwards. And here is Henry Carter. He went to India. He'd gone to India before the first edition was published. His work in India became very famous. He was a pathologist. He studied fungal diseases. He met Henson, he of leprosy. fame. And Carter's obituary in the BMJ is actually, it's longer than a page. And it celebrates those excellent images which have contributed so materially to smooth the thorny path of the student of human anatomy. And when he died, or very recently, a blue plaque was erected in Scarborough, where he was born. Henry Vandyke Carter, pathologist and illustrator of Gray's Anatomy, lived here. And I don't know if you can see this because I can't see me on the screen, but he's been looking at me all through my talk. And this is the self-portrait that he sent back from India to his family. So it's been my great privilege and great honor to be the editor-in-chief of Gray's. It's a book I first encountered, as I said, back in 1964 when I was a med student. It's a book that's been with me all of my professional life, and I shall miss it. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Susan. I have to say, for taking us on that fascinating anatomical journey. There's some wonderful images there as well. We've got some questions, if that's okay. Do
you want to lose this slide? Because I can't even see me at the moment. Hang on a minute. Let me. Where am I?
Yeah, if you maybe stop sharing.
Hi. Actually, okay. I can now, in case people didn't see that, I can now show it to you properly, and you can see it. There it is.
There he is.
Okay, cool.
Great. I just wanted to cover some of the questions, if that's okay, Susan.
Yeah.
We've got one here that says, why did it take so long to switch to a regional approach? T.B. Johnson wrote a book called A Synopsis of Regional Anatomy, which I used as a student in the 1960s.
Because nobody wanted to, is the simple answer. This was the way Gray's was, and I don't think it occurred to anybody. Maybe I think it might be as simple as that. I agree with you. It seems to me utterly ludicrous to learn anatomy in a systematic way, because you're never going to encounter anatomy systematically like that. But I know that when I was asked what I would do to Gray's if I became editor-in-chief, I said, well, it has to be regional. And most people seem to think it was a good idea, but a number of anatomists said, oh, you've got to keep it systematic. So I think it just took courage.
Thank you, Susan. We've got some more questions. Have you seen, from David Hill, have you seen the 1918 American edition of Gray's by Lewis?
Yes and no. I'm not sure. I don't think so. Please tell me about it. Why should I know about it?
We'll see if David replies.
David, get in touch with me, and I'd love to talk to you about it.
Well, this isn't a question, this is a comment, or rather a thank you from Ravi Punwani, who says, thank you for teaching me anatomy at UMDS 20 years ago.
Cool. Nice to speak to you. I hope you're well.
And a question from Rishikesh, why is Sir Astley Cooper's observation on importance of anatomy and dissection not relevant today? Or why should it not be relevant today? It
is still relevant today, but there are great problems in trying to teach cadaveric dissection to very large numbers of students in a very time-poor curriculum. And I think the fact that you need to have dissected, if not formal and fixed material, but certainly as a surgical trainee, if you have not encountered a mixture of frozen thawed, unembalmed cadavers or soft fixed cadavers coupled with simulations, haptic simulations, you won't have learned your anatomy adequately before you get into theatres. But for a medical student to dissect a whole body, it just cannot happen today because there isn't time, there isn't space in the curriculum. But I'm all in favour of students dissecting one region in a special study module or something like that, so that they at least get to understand tissue relationships. They can see their anatomy in 3 dimensions. I would like to see more dissection, but it isn't going to happen. We have to be realistic.
Thank you, Susan. I've got a couple more comments for you here. one from an anonymous attendee saying,
Oh,
what a feeling it would be learning from a book and then becoming the editor itself. Bless you.
thank
And,
you. Yes.
and another one from Sharose. Apologies if I've pronounced your name incorrectly. Thank you so much for your wonderful work with the most precious book on anatomy.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I have to tell you that when I was a student, I used Gray's Anatomy a lot. And my husband, who was then my boyfriend, said he could never get my nose out of Gray's Anatomy. That's not quite true, but I certainly loved it. And in fact, if you can see behind me on, can you see over there, that red book there, that is my first Gray's, and it's much smaller than the other Gray's, which are the ones that I edited.
Well, that's actually a fantastic segue, Susan, into the next question
Oh.
from Tim Westwood. Is there anything you wanted to include but weren't able to in the 42nd edition?
I think yes, but it would be more in terms of presentation. I would love to have been able to have more fly-throughs, imaging fly-throughs, for example, in combinations of PET and it would mostly have been imaging, because of course you're going to feed over into, say, Gray's surgical anatomy. It's a question of where you stop, but I think anatomy now is, so much of it is based on imaging. Okay, it's a kind of circular argument because you have to know your anatomy in order to interpret and validate the images that you see. But I think it is such a dynamic process. If you look at images today, they're not single images. You're flying through, they're very dynamic, and I'd like to have been able to do that, but not possible. I'd like to have had more surface anatomy as well, in terms of surface anatomy that was dynamic, videos. Can't do everything.
No, I can imagine the book could just go on and on. And
I think so. And I think it will continue to grow, and I shall be very interested to see how it develops. I mean, if you just look here on the screen, this is this amazing image, which is cinematic rendering of a living heart. I mean, it is quite extraordinary what can now be done and what can be seen. But of course, you have to, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Deb, but you have to know the anatomy and all of these wonderful techniques, endoscopy, computer-assisted surgery, all the different kinds of modalities of imaging. Always you have to know the anatomy to validate what you see. You can't look at a diffusion tensor imaging, a view of the brain, and say, oh, I know what that tract is. No, you have to understand that, A, that's not an actual picture of the fiber tract. It's a probabilistic map of the diffusion of water molecules longitudinally. But you have to know that it's there to start with.
And Susan, sorry, to interrupt you then, but I wanted to ask, actually, this is my question. What do anatomy books of the future look like? So obviously there's a lot more imaging now in Gray's Anatomy than there was previously. How do you think that the books will change in the future, or the way anatomy is taught?
It depends. A lot of it will be online, it will be electronic, it will be very interactive. I imagine that certainly for students, it will be even more interactive in terms of being case-based. So that, again, it's like Henry Gray and Henry Vandyke Carter. You are looking at a subject that is allowing you to understand and interpret what you find with your patient. And so they'll be much more integrated with the anatomy and the physiology and the pharmacology. And a lot of it will be handheld. It won't be a great big tome like that I used to lug on the train. It'll be on your phone or whatever. Well, I don't know the form of books, what they'll be like. It'll be three-dimensional, maybe it'll be virtual reality with headsets, which are fantastic, but they are still only, you don't really get to do it until you get hands on a patient, and then you're saying, what is the basic stuff that I know here? And it's important that everybody learns the anatomy they need at the level that they need. Gray's is not a student book. It stopped being a student book 100 years ago.
Thank you, Susan. We've got lots more questions. There's one from Rachel Kerslake, who says, after all these years and revisions and collaborators, do you think the title Gray's Anatomy is still the best name for this book? It's so widely known. Do you think it will ever change?
I think you just answered your own question. It's so widely known. I don't think it will change. Were it to change, I think it should be Gray and Carter. And I think it's disappointing that it was never. Carter was, I think he was so important in selling the book that it's very unfortunate that it's not grey and cut. And I don't think it'll ever change now. It'll always be G-R-A-Y, though. It'll never be G-R-E-Y as
Yeah.
Grey's Anatomy. But I don't know.
It feels like it's synonymous with anatomy. Great.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so, yes.
And then another question here from Thomas. Hello from University College London, and thank you for the fascinating talk. I wonder currently, what are the relationships between the original Grey's Anatomy and the other Greys, like Grey's Anatomy for Students? Would the original Greys eventually be replaced by the more specialised Greys? Well, that's an interesting question.
I think Grey's Anatomy for Students, I mean, that's not part of what I do. So I think what we do with Grey's Anatomy, what I call Daddy Greys, the big Greys, is that it's evidence-based. It's just much more detailed. It's simply the level at which you're working. Grey's Anatomy is a huge reference book, and you can take bits of that out. And in fact, some of the pictures in Grey's Anatomy for Students, we use the same basic pictures, some of them in the large Greys, in the 42nd edition. Because you're just building on the base that you have. So I think the big Greys will stay as the reference book. Grey's Anatomy for Students will continue to develop, and some of the images there, some of the drawings there are quite fascinating that Richard Tibbets and his crew have developed. And Grey's Surgical Anatomy will develop in its own way, and they form part of a stable.
I've got a question here from Adamola, who says, hello, Professor Standring. Firstly, thank you for teaching me anatomy at UMDS back in 1996.
Wow.
She says, still an anatomy geek today. What are your thoughts about integrating ultrasonography in the student curriculum to complement surface and wet specimen tutelage?
I think it's a great idea, providing there is time. I think if you could do that more particularly in the clinic or in a clinical situation, I think yes, I think integration is the way to go with these things, because as you know, learning something like anatomy, which is full of facts, and just trying to remember those facts to pass an exam, but not applying them, they don't mean very much. And I think something like ultrasonography, where the images are complicated, and I'm not suggesting that students are going to become expert ultrasonographers. I'm the first one to put my hand up and say I find it extraordinarily difficult. Even if someone takes me by the hand and says, this is the internal jugular, I say, well, fine, okay, and that's the thyroid, fine, and whatever. But I certainly think that students should use it with their surface anatomy. It seems to me that for many students, the surface anatomy is almost the most important anatomy they're going to learn, and they don't learn it. And I think if they're learning it with the ultrasound, that's good. I would support that. But you need time, and you need money, and you need space, and you need all of these things we don't have.
I have another comment from Prudy. Thank you for your lovely sharing today. And then a question from Connor. I wonder if you think there's still a place for more artistic renderings of anatomy like those of Vesalius, Rush and our other forebears, or have we evolved past this to make anatomy more digestible as a study companion?
The answer is yes. I think we have probably moved past them, but I agree with you absolutely in terms of those beautiful images. The first time I opened an original Vesalius, it was hairs on the back of your neck standing up. They are superb images, but they're not entirely accurate, as you well know. The efforts of Cheselden and Albinus to ensure accuracy using various techniques are to be applauded, but I think they're two separate things. I think you can enjoy the older images. You can enjoy Leonardo, accuracy and inaccuracies combined, but you're never going to use them to learn your anatomy from. But I love the old images. They're just wonderful.
I have another question, Susan, from Thomas, who says, what are your thoughts about the place of the plasticized whole body displays?
Speaking absolutely personally, this has nothing to do with Elsevier. My personal thing is that where they are whole body displays of anatomy to teach anatomy to the general public, I think that's great. I'm not so keen, I have to say, on plastinated men playing chess, people having sex and riding horses. I can't quite see the point of that, frankly. But I think anything that informs the general public about structure and combining that with function. And if they understand what we look like under the skin, I think that's all to the good. I think that's really important. It's amazing how ignorant people are of the structure of their own bodies. But there's a fine line that the educational use of plastinated material, I think, is very valuable. But again, as part of an integrated course, so that you might combine that with images and with straightforward anatomy. I don't go bundle on the rest of it, particularly when it's got James Bond wandering around in it, but there you go. That's just me.
I have a few more comments, actually, Susan. Lots of people really saying thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I've got one comment from Rishikesh here. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I've always been a student of anatomy since I picked up Gray's Anatomy for the first time in 1982, one of the most fascinating books.
Yeah.
And from Shiroze, to learn and remember anatomy, one should render their own 3D models in their brain. This was my technique, and of course, Gray's was my blueprint.
Yeah, that's cool. It's then keeping them in there. Once you get to my age, they tend to fall out again. But I couldn't agree with you more. The more effort and energy you put into learning it, and very good to keep it three-dimensional, absolutely, which is where going back to the surface anatomy and the ultrasound, all of these things. I mean, however you learn it, you have to learn it because you're going to use it. And for students of medicine and surgery, remember, you're learning this. I used to say to students, when they didn't do well in their exams, look, and they didn't pass, you failed because you didn't know it, and we have a responsibility as your teachers to ensure that you are safe to proceed, because you're going to be dealing with humans, with patients, and if you make a mistake, they can have very serious consequences. If you make a mistake in a history exam, it doesn't matter too much, but if you make a mistake in an anatomy exam, it's rather more important, the consequences.
Mm-hmm. Susan, I've got a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine. Yes.
Oh, in fact, the more they just keep coming in. Here's one. Do you think the anatomy knowledge of students today is worse than in the past?
I can't really answer that because I retired back in 2008, so I haven't encountered students recently. I think that it might be different. I think what you learn at the beginning of your course, that's no indication of what you're going to know clinically when you graduate. I think when you graduate, you should know sufficient anatomy to be able to examine your patient effectively, to interpret what you find, and you should be at the level that is required in your foundation years. And as you go on, you will learn more anatomy. I think students today have so many more subjects. I mean, when I was a student, we had anatomy on one day, physiology on one day, biochemistry on one day, pharmacology on one day, and then it went round again. And it wasn't integrated, and there was never any mention of patients. So it was different, but we didn't have all the other subjects that you have. So my guess is you will know less anatomy, but you might actually apply it rather better than we could.
I have a question from Stephanie. As a student in the long room, I learned more than anatomy. I learned respect and gratitude for our body, who had allowed herself to be used. I also learned a 3D muscle memory of anatomy. Is there any other way of getting that, as well as the simple anatomy, if students are not to dissect a body?
The assumption is that they will gain it by body painting, by surface anatomy, by virtual reality headsets. There is another assumption, is that maybe they won't need as much anatomy until they qualify, until they start to specialize. There are many ways of learning anatomy. Dissection is a good way to learn it, but it's not the only way. And I think with all of the modern methods, interactive methods of learning anatomy, I think it should be a combination of things. But I repeat, I think it is a pity if students at no stage in their career ever get to do any dissection. It doesn't have to be the whole body. I mean, you could just spend a term just dissecting the wrist, for goodness sake. But what a wonderful experience that would be.
I've got a question from as me. Thank you for this wonderful talk and this equally interesting Q&A. Such good questions. As technology advances, additional efforts seem to be needed to understand what exactly we're seeing. Do you think that Gray's or any anatomy book should necessarily aim to present anatomy as it is visible in person or through the lens of these imaging technologies?
I think we should present it as it is visible. The through the lens would be wonderful, which I think I alluded to when someone asked me what I'd like to see developing in Gray's. Because, you know, you still have a book, you have your iPad, you have the videos. You can't go much further other than having on your desk, on your screen, what you're seeing when someone is in the radiology suite examining a patient. I hope that answered the question. I'm not sure that I did. If I didn't, please come back.
David, who asked the question earlier about the American edition of Gray's, has sent through his email address, Susan, so I will pass that on.
Thank you very much, David. I look forward to that. Thank you.
And then I think maybe it may be time to close things. There are a few more comments that I just wanted to read out, Susan. One from Manju, who says, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I've always been fascinated by Gray's Anatomy, and it's one of my most valued and prized possessions. Yeah. And another comment from Gustavo, who says, thanks a lot for a fantastic presentation. I'm a vet, and I enjoy reading human anatomy in my spare time while comparing species in my mind from an evolutionary perspective.
Oh, Gustavo, that is wonderful, because the one thing I would like to know is much more comparative anatomy. I think vets are extraordinary. And I love looking at skeletons of animals. My small grandson showed me something the other day and said, what do you think this is, Grandma? I hadn't a clue. I had to ask some friends at the veterinary college, and it turned out in the end it was the furcula of an old swan. So there you go. Those of you who don't know what the furcula is, it's sort of fused clavicles. Gustavo will know. But I just think actually learning some comparative anatomy, it's like learning developmental anatomy. It's understanding how things get where they are and how the function developed, and seeing how things work in other animals is just fascinating. I mean, I've got a book on my shelf behind me, which is nothing other than comparative anatomy of the brachial plexus, and it's amazing.
Just a few final comments. One from Carmis, thanks a million for this fruitful session, and another one from Kim. Thank you so much for your lecture. I absolutely agree that fundamental anatomy must be learned in 3 dimensions. Understanding this with reference to surface anatomy and imaging is key. Gray's has been part of my practice and teaching for so many years as a physiotherapist.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. I mean, there was a paper not many years ago now by radiologists saying, are radiologists the new anatomists? And I believe they are. I mean, I believe that, well, every chapter in Gray's, the 42nd edition, is written by a surgeon or revised by a surgeon, other than the cell biology and the developmental biology sections. And I believe that one of the reasons that the book sort of was static for a long time is that the surgeons disappeared and the radiologists, they weren't an active part of the editorial team, because I am always in awe of the anatomy that my radiological and surgical colleagues know. It is staggering.
So, Susan, I think I'd like to end on another comment from Manjinder, who says, thank you very much for this presentation. Understanding the history always makes learning much more interesting. And I just really wanted to echo everyone's thanks for the session. Sorry, Susan, you wanted to say something?
I didn't want to say anything. I was just taking a deep breath.
So I just really wanted to say thank you, and thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. Thank you so much for all of your questions and for your comments to Susan, and really a huge thank you to Susan, you know, for giving up your time and for taking us. I know that you feel very passionately about the subject, and, you know, it's wonderful to be able to experience it with you. And I just wanted to say a big thank you. You've done this for us more than once, and we hugely appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think I have one more lecture to give this year and one more lecture next year, and then I have no more lectures ever. So
well,
it's quite an emotional moment for you, and I'm very glad to have been able to talk to you about Gray's. It's a book I love, and I would love Henry Gray and Henry Carter to see it now.
That's a wonderful thought. And a lovely thought to end on. Thank you, Susan, once again.
You're welcome.
We really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening, everyone. It's been great to talk to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.